Hello and welcome to this video. I spotted a comment on one of my videos recently. I can't remember who put it up. I read it and then it went round my mind. And I'd have to go through all the comments and search to find out who wrote it. So I apologise for whoever suggested this. But I am going to take on the question that was asked in this comment, which was, why do all modern jazz musicians sound the same? Okay, so I sort of agree with this. I have a big network of musicians I know. We're always checking out new players, and very often someone will go, "Oh, Andy, because I'm a drummer, go and check this drummer out. You've got to check this drummer out," and they'll send me a link across. And I can sort of predict what I'm about to see. You know, the modern jazz drummer is going to do a whole ton of things, and we know what they're going to do. The virtuoso level of modern jazz players is off the charts now. You know, everybody is incredible, unbelievably fast. They're blistering. They're going to be playing the sort of, you know, gospel chops derived fills. We're going to be getting the sort of metric modulation. We're going to have, you know, the sort of crossovers between the hi-hats and the floor tom. I can sort of predict what I'm about to see. Now, that seems to be the case right across the board. When someone says, check this guitarist out, I know I'm going to get something which is somewhere between Matheny, Schofield and Holdsworth. You know, there's going to be that sort of sound. Now, if we go back, say, to the 1950s, and I would say, you know, like, name some jazz pianists. So let's say Thelonious Monk, Dave Brubeck, Bud Powell, Bill Evans. There's four pianists off the top of my head, so I really haven't prepared this. Each of those is a whole complete world of difference to the next one. They're instantly recognisable. I've just, you know, filmed a video on Jaco Pastorius, and the overriding thing that came out of that, because I've been listening to so much Jaco recently, is as soon as Jaco's on that album, you go, oh, Jaco's on that album. Oh yeah, you hear that? Oh, doesn't he sound amazing? You could hear him beaming out, okay? I think this is the first place we can start to try and explore why individualism in jazz has diminished. I'm sure people are going to now start shouting all sorts of musicians at me, which they believe are highly individual, okay? But we are talking about not individual cases here, but a certain trend. And I think the fact that a number of people have said this to me over the years, you know, about modern jazz musicians, that I think by exploring it and having a look at the context in which jazz is made today might give us a clue to why people at least perceive that as happening. Okay? So let's go back to the sort of the Thelonious Monk, Bill Evans, Jaco Pastorius example that we just had. You know, in the old days, you could buy an album and you put that album on, and that album is coming to you through your ears. You know, nobody's listening with their eyes, they're listening with their ears. You know, you put the album on and that album has a voice on it. Now, one of the great innovations of jazz was the development of the idea of the individual voice. Now, having an individual voice is actually quite difficult in music, because music is based upon composition, and compositions are based upon somebody writing something that is then going to be performed by musicians, and those musicians need to be predictable, okay? You need to know what a bass is going to sound like. You need to know what a violin is going to sound like, you know. If Beethoven's writing a piece for orchestra, and everybody in that orchestra had their own sound. You know, one guy's playing his violin with a saw, and the next one's doing loops and delays and all that. It just doesn't work, you know. For composition to work, there has to be some predictability in the sound. When jazz emerges, because there's an improvisatory aspect, it allows musicians to find their own place. Louis Armstrong is the great genius of this, in terms of his trumpet playing and his voice, in the way he plays his personal voice. Now, the thing is that this coincides with the emergence of the recorded music industry. And so people are buying records. And And when you buy a Bing Crosby album or a Frank Sinatra album or an Ella Fitzgerald album, you know, if you buy an Aretha Franklin album or a David Bowie album, what you're buying is the sound of their voice. You're not buying virtuoso singing. Virtuoso singing can sound very similar, right? What you're sounding is the grain and the tone and the timbre of the voice, the way it's phrased, the individuality that is within that sound. This is the bedrock of commercial music. If you're listening, if you're buying music to have a commodity, then you want an individual voice. Now, certain people in the old days, and this was far more apparent when I was younger, there would be people who would really love the trombone, or they would love the sound of the flute, or they would love the sound of the tenor saxophone. And so they would want to hear tunes that they liked played by that instrument. They liked the sound of that instrument. Jazz musicians emerged in the 20s and 30s playing tunes, and people would hear the tune played by that instrumentalist. And to become a star, you had to be like a Bing Crosby or an Elvis Presley. You had to have your own voice. So the recording music industry was driving musicians to have their own voice that could then be marketed, you know, on a record. You know, Stan Getz plays the Burt Bacharach, you know, that type of an album. Wes Montgomery plays the Beatles, you know, whatever it is. That is a sound. You're buying into a sound. And that would have driven, I think, the music industry to find people with an individual sound. And so within the industry, and when you talk to older jazz musicians, this is definitely the case, that to be seen to be copying somebody else's sound was seen to be morally wrong. You know, it was that strong a thing, you know, or they're copying my sound. You could see this up with, say, a musician like Alan Holdsworth. Alan Holdsworth has such a signature sound. You know, Alan Holdsworth can play a tune and it's going to be entirely different to Jeff Beck playing a tune or John McLaughlin playing a tune. They're all going to sound entirely different, even though it's the guitar. And so what is the point of copying Alan Holdsworth? Now, there's a million Alan Holdsworth copiers out there, a million of people trying to do it. So what's happened morally where people now think it's a good thing to sound like somebody else? You know, all these forums where people are trying to find out what amp did Alan Holdsworth play and what guitar and what gauge of strings, because I want to sound exactly like him, right? That, I think, is something that's emerged, and I want to now explore the next part of the jigsaw puzzle of why everyone's sounding more and more the same. So if you take the bedrock of the recorded music industry, and in the old days, you know, people were buying records which they were selling the sound of a person, an individual. So you're buying a Stan Getz album because you want it to sound like that. You want to hear John Coltrane because you want him to sound like John Coltrane, right? As the music industry collapses, people are no longer consuming jazz so much on record. We are consuming it streamed through the internet, and in most cases the thing that has saved jazz and jazz fusion has been YouTube and Instagram, where musicians are now plying their trade in a completely different way, and that has now become much more based upon virtuosity. We are listening with our eyes so much more. In the old day, the virtuosity was there, but the virtuosity was at the service of the compositions and the album. It was reined in. You know, a jazz fusion band would have to get a deal. And once you've got a deal, then you have to write some tunes, and that tunes has to be sort of okayed by the label. You know, there's commercial constraints, you know. So, you know, just shallow displays of just sheer virtuosity didn't mean anything. You know, when you listen to, say, Jaco Pastoris's debut album, which is a brilliant example of a virtuoso musician, you know, being launched into the world, what Jaco's doing is at the service of the music. There is so much composition on there, and we're astonished at the virtuosity within the context of what he's trying to achieve musically. You know, so if you're playing Donna Lee, it's the beauty of that phrased, you know, melody that Charlie Parker creates. And then it's interesting because he's playing it on a bass, and you think, oh, the bass is usually associated with playing these sort of detailed lines, but this guy's been able to do it. That's really impressive. That's where the virtuosity comes in. It's at the service of that tune. With Instagram, it's not like that. We are just literally appreciating just big slabs of raw skill being thrown at us. You know, it really is. I was going to come up with a metaphor of somebody waving in a large, a large appendage on their body at you. It's like that. As I hope I'm going to pass on from that. Let's just carry on talking. You know what I'm saying. This is something that's really emerged, and in a way, this has saved jazz, because it's YouTube has enabled musicians to keep going. God knows what would happen if there was no YouTube. That I think jazz would be dead, pretty much. Here's the interesting thing, and this is the third part of this anomaly I think that we have in today's jazz scene, is that most musicians, that interest in virtuosity emerges in musicians in their teens. You know, it's a little bit like the sort of, you know, the younger musician looking up to the older musician, you know, and going, oh my God, look how incredible they are. And that's a thing that really emerges in rock music. Most musicians start in sort of heavy metal, and they're really impressed by their heroes in heavy metal. And as you start to develop as a musician, you start to change. Some musicians do, at least, and they start to realise there's an even harder thing than playing fast heavy metal, and it's playing jazz. But when they discover that, what they discover is playing through the changes. They discover playing all these weird scales, right? Being able to superimpose chords, all that stuff which has become associated with jazz. Now, that really is not a jazz thing, it's a bebop thing. So the bebop has emerged in the 1940s, and in an almost sort of punk rock way, they were trying to challenge the orthodoxy of swing musicians by just making the music listenable rather than danceable. This was a change. You know, those musicians wanted to create serious music that was equal to classical music, but was their own music. And so they made the music very complex. And one of the ways they did that was to take the changes and just expand the changes out. This pretty quickly, to any creative musicians, became a bind, as punk rock did in the 70s. Punk rock only lasts a few years, and true bebop only really lasts a few years. By the late 40s, Miles Davis is questioning it, Lenny Tristano's questioning it, the whole bunch of musicians are actually wondering that this straitjacket of the chord changes, the straitjacket of having to jump through those hoops, is how do you bust that open. And Coltrane and Ornette Coleman and Eric Dolphy are searching for ways, and all the free jazz musicians are searching for ways of breaking that open. You know, they're trying to use modality, they're trying to use time with no changes, to free musicians so they don't have to work in that, right? That way of playing really informs jazz fusion, and you could see that jazz fusion is almost like the commercialization of free jazz and modal jazz. And it's jazz fusion in the 70s is a little bit like swing in the 30s. Jazz is suddenly really, really popular. There is, of course, a backlash against that, as there was to bebop in the 1950s. You had the trad jazz, especially here in the UK. You had trad jazz musicians who were trying so hard to emulate Kid Ory and Louis Armstrong and King Oliver, you know, really earnestly. They didn't like anything that was after a certain point in time. That happened in the 50s, and it happened again in the 1980s with that whole Wynton Marsalis, backwards looking, you know, standing there in a suit pretending it's 1962 and you're in a hard bop group. And that created this idea as jazz, you know, lost its foothold in the clubs, right? It lost its footholds on the street, you know, and it moved into the music colleges, okay? And the music colleges started to teach jazz as an ideological dogma. This is the way you play jazz. You know, that whole thing with Alex Hoffman, criticising Wayne Shorter. Alex Hoffman is just a brilliant example of a musician that's been gone in and has been indoctrinated into the ideology of jazz. And jazz only has true worth when you're doing a number of things, and those things have to happen for it to be good jazz. And there's so many jazz snobs around that will tell you what jazz should be, right? And of course, as soon as that happens, the form is hobbled. So we now have an industry of music colleges churning out jazz virtuosos who have nailed giant steps and have got all the Charlie Parker lines down, and they've learnt all their super Lockerian natural fourth scales and altered scales and Lydian flat sevens, and they can blast them over all their chord substitutions and all that, and 1,000,000 miles an hour, and they've got all their technique, and they've copied their sound, and the sound, if you're a saxophone player, is basically Michael Brecker. And if you're a drummer, it's basically sort of Dave Weckerly, Steve Gadd, Vinnie Colaiuta, and if you're a bass player, you're going to have a little bit of Jacko, a little bit of Marcus. It's all become a great big cliche tied up in an ideology that basically binds you into having to do something in a certain way. And what has been the sacrifice for that? It's been the sacrifice of musicians, being urged morally to not do that, to do something new. There's a brilliant quote by Keith Jarrett when he was in Miles Davis' band, and somebody said, "What was Miles like?" And he said, well, Miles would rather have been in a bad band playing bad music, I'm paraphrasing this, than play what he had played before. That is a true jazz musician. The jazz giants that emerged, right? They were coming from a different place, and their experimentation was at the forefront of music. The musicians like Coltrane, who pioneered all the stuff that people are now copying in colleges, that was done on the bandstand. These guys would read about some weird scale, and then they would go up there and they would play it, and they would find out, because they wanted not to play the scale because it was clever, because they were trying to free music. They were trying to bust it out of the place where it is now. That used to be the job of jazz. Jazz was a nuclear reactor that you threw music in and new forms came out. Now the problem is, when you do that, is sometimes new forms really do come out. And I think the jazz that I love, right, that beautiful, exciting period that runs from the 60s, say 1959 to around about 1974, that is an incredible run of classic albums like Kind of Blue, Mingus R. Giant Steps, Time Out by Brubeck. If you look at that watershed, which sums up everything that has happened in jazz, and then at that point it then splits off into all these different incredible forms. And the 1960s, which is that watershed period where arts are just moving at such an incredible rate. So we go from pretty much in 1959 Kind of Blue, by 1969 Miles is making Bitches Brew. It's an incredible travel, right? And I think what happened in the 60s is that what jazz musicians were doing went beyond the scope of jazz, right? You want to know where the influence of jazz is? It's always outside jazz, okay? I was watching a video the other day which was discussing the sort of little, what's the word? There was an interview in the 80s between Wynton Marsalis and Herbie Hancock, where it seemed like Wynton had thrown a pot shot at Herbie for making popular music, and Herbie then was in an interview where he basically told Wynton that he didn't understand pop music and he should keep his mouth shut. It's a fascinating discussion between the two, and on that video they make the point that Rocket by Herbie Hancock is not a jazz track. Okay, is it a jazz track or not? Well, It's not a jazz track, but it's entirely come out of jazz. And the whole thing about Rocket is Rocket was created by Bill Laswell. And Bill Laswell is a musician that emerged in the late 70s, who was pulling together free jazz influences, Ornette Coleman, with hip hop and free jazz, hip hop, punk, and was pulling all those things together at that time. Jazz played a huge part in the creation of that sound. Rocket is an example of a track that then goes on to change the sound of 80s music and change the music industry, change the way MTV works, because Herbie Hancock was one of the first black artists to be featured on MTV. All that is coming from jazz. It's not coming from what Wynton Marsalis is doing. It's not coming from what the mainstream jazz is doing. It's coming from somewhere else. And the problem is that once you shut that down, once you stop by putting the straitjacket of what jazz should be on musicians, right? You no longer have jazz. What you have is a museum piece. And I think that's what we've got today. And you will spot it all over YouTube and the internet, with people telling you how to play jazz and what it should sound like and what it should be. And you will see how important the virtuoso element is, how it's the overriding thing, and how we've lost that joy and wonder of the sound of a great musician sounding like themselves. This is something that has gone out of our culture, and the reason is because the value we put on self-expression has diminished culturally, but that is another video. Anyway, thanks for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed my little stream of consciousness on that topic. And I hope I didn't get myself too confused. I tried my best. It's lovely to be able to sit down and have a channel where I can just come in and just free associate like this and see what happens, and talk about the philosophy of music, because we need to keep talking about that. And I know it's appreciated by those who watch this channel a lot. So I know this won't get the views that, the 10 greatest, boxer shorts in progressive rock. See, now I have to make that video, don't I? Anyway, I will finish there. If you like this video and you want more of the philosophical stuff, then, like it, and then press the notification bell and click subscribe and all that bit. And if you really want to get into heavier discussions and get into much deeper topics than this, then please pop over to my Patreon, where I go deeper into this stuff. Anyway, thanks for watching this video. I'll see you on the next one. Thank you.